Okay, here we are again. It's lovely to see you again. It's a follow-up conversation on our previous one. We're still navigating our pathway through creating the narrative eventually for a book that will be written on your life and your experiences, right? And so my sense is that last time, one of the notes, the key notes that we left with to follow up on was the whole issue of wedlock, out of wedlock, and what follows after that, from both from society, but also from an inner self-judgment perspective. So is that a good place to pick up?
It is a good place to pick up, because what we really want to deal with today is judgment. Why is illegitimacy an issue? Shouldn't we celebrate the life that has come and that God has allowed to be created? And then, what are the wise choices that come along with an illegitimate child? And what are his or her possibilities in society? Because in all scriptures, we should all have an equal opportunity. So why does the illegitimate child not have the same opportunity as a child born in a married situation? And we come across this, I'm using my life as an example. But in the series that we have actually done together, the Another Self, this whole issue of the illegitimate child is actually coming up. And the energies that are then between a mother and a father that never actually have a child. And then there is the living child. And yet there is so much thought and so much energy on the child that is illegitimate, that in that story was aborted, and yet it had a lot of focus. So this is a very, very tender subject. And
yes.
Bjorn, it's been a tender subject because we had to reschedule this a few times. And even this morning, going in, we had struggles coming in. So
yeah,
it is an awareness that people do not want to talk about. It is something that people would rather negate. But when I do family constellations, and I had a client with my last constellation, and there was a lot of strife between the siblings. Wow, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm speaking. We had to bring in the children that were either stillborn or we didn't put what happened, but they did not come into fruition of this life. And how that really has an effect in the whole structure of the siblings. And so I think, yes, it's a tender subject. I feel comfortable talking about it in my personal story because I am at peace, and I have made peace with my siblings as well as my father. So I want to put that out there. So
right.
Thank you for taking on this very difficult subject to speak about today.
Yeah. So that's it's very interesting because our last recording, we also started with the hero's journey. Now, in the hero's journey, there's a moment where the hero needs to go through certain thresholds before he's ready for the next phase of his life. And at those thresholds are certain threshold guardians. And they basically stop you. And the question at the threshold guardian stage is, are you ready to go to the next? And it's almost like what we have experienced this morning to get to this call is begging the question. This is going to be a tight subject in a discussion, but are you ready to go? Are you brave enough? Are you courageous enough to go there? And I'm very happy that you say that you are, because you have made that peace. But key to what you also said, relating to the previous series recording that we had, was this whole thing about once there's conceptualization of a baby, it has its place in the system, no matter what. And the more the surface systemic behavior wants to push that into the unseen world as if it's non-existent, the more symptoms pop up in the life of a family in whatever form. I just want to also just nominate that as one of our key components in the work, is to see what is pushed into the subconscious, what is pushed into secrecy.
And that's exactly why I do believe that, although it's a tender subject, exactly for that reason, we would rather not speak about it. We would rather not think about it. That is why we need to actually talk about it.
Yeah. Good. So
in Family Constellation, and I think we want to look at how is the view of the legitimate child in Family Constellation is the view of the legitimate child. And I want to specifically go to the time where I was born, which was quite a few years ago, in the mid-50s, and how that may have changed from then to now, but some elements have not changed. And so there is this, I'm going to call the word judgment on the legitimate child. The legitimate child was seen as the child of sin. And the first time, I have to share the story. The first time I came across this, the child of sin, was when I was in boarding school. And I was always the child that had to bear the brunt of everybody else's misdemeanors. And I could never figure out why. But when I had one of those misdemeanors put on my back again, my punishment was to wash walls. And I was really good at washing walls at one stage. And but on this particular day, I was particularly upset, and one of the nuns coming past was sort of talking to me. Normally I was ignored, but this time the nun talked to me, and I was complaining to her about my question as to why I was always the one who was selected to do the punishment. And why was I selected to do the punishment? And I was sort of having this question that I posed to the nun. She was willing to speak to me, and I just wanted an answer. And it's the first time I heard, it's because you are the child of sin. And as I'm speaking here now, I'm getting a little bit of goosebumps, because at that time, I did not understand what she was actually saying. It confused me even more. Because at that time, I lived with a mother and a father in a home, and I was taken to boarding school for the simple reason that in Namibia, there's not good schooling, and it was a good school to go to. we need to bear in mind that the school was mostly run by Irish nuns. So let's look at the history of the Irish Catholic Church. And if you go into the history of the Irish Catholic Church, the condemnation of the illegitimate child is massive. In fact, if you were an illegitimate child, you were condemned to work in the laundry. You were condemned to the lowest of the lowest living. That was if you were lucky enough to survive. Or if you were unlucky and not be able to post it for adoption. Most adoptions were posted to America. So that was a belief system in the Catholic Church where these nuns grew up in. So we need to look at the background of their belief system and why they have this, you are a child of sin and therefore you are condemned, that was a natural answer for her to give me. And what she basically also tried to tell me is, you are privileged because we actually allow you to be with us, to have an education with us. So I was privileged in that I was not condemned to be the lowest of the low, as would have been if I had my life starting in Ireland, where their belief system actually came from. So here is this little girl who has no background on that, who knows nothing about that, but yet this is given to her, and this is a sentence that has sort of focused me to answer or look for answers to the question, but what is the real energy around the illegitimate child? So we have an answer in the family constellations, but let's just look at, that was not just a belief system in the Catholic Church, and it's not just in Ireland where this belief system was held up. It is a belief system that has come from all religious backgrounds. If we look at the history, and it's still happening today, where the woman, if she is raped, she is actually killed because it's her fault for being raped in some cultures and in some countries.
Yeah.
And we see that again in another self, the big secret that Sefki's mother had to hold to not declare who the father is, because Sefki herself, the honor was kept because the mother married another man to give her a name and for her to be born into wedlock. So be born into wedlock was really, really, really important. And this is across all cultures. So it's not just in one or the other culture. So I think we need to look at it from that perspective. And then I want to ask the question, but why is it like that? But I want to answer that question a little later. I want to look at, let's look at the energy. And I need to refer back to my story because I can talk about my story. I'm not comfortable to talk about anybody else's story. So in my story, the father had an out of his wedding vows intimacy with another woman. Now, just look at that concept. The wedding vows are, I will be truthful and honor one woman only. So then this mishap out of wedlock is a sin in the eyes of the religious belief. And the question is, why is it a sin? So I think here I want to talk about it a little bit more from the systemic view. Because as long as a man is in the family system is safe. He is the provider, he is the protector, and if the father then steps out of the family system is no longer safe. Because now if there is a life that is created, there is another mouth to feed. There is another family to support.
Yeah.
So that is something that makes this family system of his children not safe. So we need to just bring that into context.
Yeah. I think that's an extremely valuable point not to miss, because not only is it about the safety of the physical protection of the family system, but more even it's about the emotional unsafety. So the system, the family then also go into a place where they feel unsafe. Why? Because emotionally there's a disconnection with the father, because the father's attention is somewhere else.
Yes. And so we need to really need to take that into consideration. The woman that he has intimacy with cannot expect safety. When she engages with a married man, then she cannot expect safety. So she then has a whole different complex of issues that she has to deal with. So let's go with the mother's issues first. At the time of my conception, my mother's father had just recently passed away from a heart attack. Her father was employed in the same company as my birth father. And as one of the benefits of that employment was the housing for his family was secured. The fact that it was a factory shed is beside the point. He had a place, a roof over the head for his family. Because my mother also worked for the same company, but she was in a much junior position, that benefit was not transferable to her. Right. So with the birth of her father, she and her mother lost the roof over their heads to start off with. So she already was in a really difficult situation, having lost the roof over her head, having lost her father, and she was extra vulnerable, which is not an excuse.
So let's just make it clear. Her father passed away, had lost his rights to have housing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, and she was vulnerable, but she was also emotionally, mentally in not a good space. The father, if I call him my birth father,
yes,
was instrumental in trying to secure some safety for her going forward, and one thing led to another, and they fell for each other. There was a deep love between them. That much I know. But now let's look at his side. He is a man of high standing. in society, he carries responsibilities in society, and especially in the religious congregation that he was part of. And that is very key. Let's go back to when you step out of your marriage, you will be judged for your sidestep. Yeah. And that judgment is severe, because that judgment can mean his loss of his reputation, the loss of his standing in the society he is, the loss of the goodwill of the congregation he is part of. So that judgment weighed on him heavily. What was he to do? So I understand his instinctual thought of, I need to make this problem go away. I think that's a good solution. If I can make this problem go away, I don't lose anything. So can you see how this child now creates a huge dilemma for both sides of her now new family system?
Yeah.
So what was he to do? First of all, he needed to keep his job. Secondly, he needed to keep his lifeline in his congregation and his lifeline going forward in the society that he was part of. So the problem had to go away. Absolutely. So I want to make it very clear that when I understood his dilemma, I no longer could judge him for the possible thoughts he had to have me aborted. For me, there is, I don't know, if I was put in that situation, what my choice of redemption would be. I can't put myself into those shoes. On the mother's side, her choice or her idea to have me adopted was a very good choice, because she wanted a good life for her child. So it was a possible choice, but it was also a choice that meant she had to disappear out of where she was living, because she needed now to safeguard the father of his child, his safety, his reputation, and whatever he needed. So she had to cut away from all other family ties, which was her brother living in the same town, and set up a new space for herself and her mother. Now just imagine, you are pregnant. What chances do you have of getting a job? What chances do you have of making a new beginning in this state? Her mother had never worked. Her mother was a housewife all her life. So there's a big burden on this woman.
Yeah, yeah.
And
also the context of that, it's just after the Second World War, it's the 50s. It's a completely different time frame, time capsule in which they found themselves. So the judgment and society was, it was high alert on who is out of line.
Exactly. And now this woman who had nothing to offer the world now has her daughter and her granddaughter on the way. It's a massive, massive burden for everybody concerned. And when you look at the child who is in this turmoil in the womb with all this is going on, there's a lot happening for the child, a lot of insecurity, a lot of unanswered questions. My grandmother did manage to get a job at a store in Namibia. It was like you had like what we have today, the garage stores. And
Yes.
she got a job there as a sales lady. And I believe my mother got the job there to do books. So,
Right.
so they were able to move to another even tinier little dorpy village, tiny village in Namibia, in the middle of the desert, into virtually a shack.
Mm.
So they managed to secure a roof over their head with a very wealthy couple. They secured a roof over their head, they secured a job, and this is where then I was eventually born. So, but now I'm talking about judgment. They had to leave everything that was of comfort behind because, first of all, to secure the father's future, and then also who would take on a woman who had no job, the judgment around that. You are nothing, you're worth nothing, you're worth less than nothing. So, okay, you can get a menial job. So imagine menial job, minimum pay. That's all that somebody would give them. And a woman who's desperate because she is pregnant and, well, she can do books. So again, she is desperate, so minimal pay will do. So, and a shack, roof over their head, they are very privileged. They are very lucky. And that is the judgment that society places on you when you are in this distressful situation.
It is absolutely amazing that with the judgment also come this voice, yeah, but you're so privileged. You know, even the nun had to remind you of that. You are the child of sin and you're so privileged. How those two things go together. It's like such a dualism.
It is interesting looking at it now. And I think we can discuss this in maybe one of the future videos.
Yes.
So, yes. And then I was born, and the couple that was going to adopt me was living in the village next door. And there was another little girl being born at the same time, and they chose the other little girl. And my mother was really resentful of her little girl that was screaming her head off, and therefore the couple didn't want her. So she now was stuck with this little girl to feed, with virtually nothing for herself. And her and her mother did their utmost to feed this little girl.
And on top of that, she's not an easy baby.
She's a difficult baby with a lot of trauma. And when I look at it now, I realize that this child was screaming because there was a lot of trauma, and it was not being heard, not being seen, not being validated, even at that early an age. But there's a positive in the story. So the couple, the family where my mother and her mother lived in the outhouse that has a toilet outside. So quite an interesting dynamic. She heard this little child scream, and the mother had to work, the grandmother had to work, and she was an elderly lady. Her children were already teenagers and out of the house. And she then sort of became my day mother. She then looked after me. How lucky am I not?
Amazing. Yes.
What is interesting about this particular woman, I met her many, many, many years later, where she told me the story. And the way I met her is so interesting. My husband's first marriage had gone south, and he had a little boy, and him and his first wife had this family connection, this friends in the family connection. And we went to visit them because Her name was Valerie, and her husband was very ill. And we went to support her and her husband. I did not know who she was. And Valerie is the woman who looked after me when I was a little baby. So we met again.
Amazing.
At a very much later stage in life. And I just thought it's a nice completion to knowing that it was good for me to reconnect with somebody who possibly saved my life at a very early age.
So that the energy around that feels very nice. So why don't you say a little bit more about that encounter, that meeting?
Well, with Valerie, so what is very interesting about Valerie is that when my husband was going through his difficult times, his wife had left and he also was stuck. He had to go to work. He had also the screaming child. It's very interesting, the screaming child who had also gone through a lot of trauma. And Valerie said, bring him to me for a few days until you can secure other means of him being well taken care of. And so Valerie also took care of who then became my little boy at that stage.
Okay.
But it was before my time. So Valerie took care of him before my time. But it's very interesting that Valerie took care of me when my mother needed help and took care of my son when he needed help.
Amazing. Amazing.
So there's good in everything. And
yeah.
And what I'm taking from Valerie did not have judgment.
Yeah.
Valerie came from, these people need help. And she came from an open heart. And that open heart is what my grandmother, my mother, and I needed. Because judgment closed all the doors. And an open heart basically opened the doors.
So Valerie definitely adopted a kind of benevolent elder role in your system.
Yes. Yes. She's not the only one, but she's the first one.
Yeah. And how long did she look after you?
Not too long, because my grandmother then got another job offer in another town. So she left. My father by this time had moved to another town because there was talk, and he was then promoted to a different part of the company, to a different division of the company. So he moved on, and my mother then went back to the town where I was conceived, and she started finding a job there. She found also another room in the back garden of somebody else's property. And so, but she had a roof over her head for her child. She had a job to go to, and she could make a new start for herself. But all this had taken a massive toll on her, because now she comes into a town where there's a lot of judgment on her. And there's a lot of pressure on her to bring up this child who was and still was a difficult child. So unfortunately for my mother, this child, me, landed up getting whooping cough. And whooping cough in those days, definitely, and even today, you could easily die from it. So again, she was put into a situation. She can't stay home with her child. This child is sick. She doesn't know what to do. And she's basically at the brink of giving up. And here enters my next mother, who was a Herrera woman that worked for the family where my mother had a room in, or in the yard that my mother had a room at. And this Herrera woman was very strict with my mother. She said to my mother, leave the child with me. You go about your business, leave the child with me. So again, from a woman that had no judgment, a woman that had, I'm getting teary, only love for a child that was in desperate need.
Unconditional
love. And she took this child, and for 3 months she kept this child close to her and bringing her back to life.
Wow.
So my life was revived by this Herero woman, who I believe is still my guardian today, who has basically taken on a very, very important role at that time of my life. So when we look at judgment, what judgment breaks up and what judgment does not allow, and what love does allow, it's very interesting. But in this time, when my mother was back in the little dormitory where I was created, there was another wonderful woman in my life, of my father's children, her husband's children. She knew who I was. She knew I was her husband's child. Nobody else knew. She and her twin sister knew. Nobody else knew. It was that deep a secret.
Wow.
And I have a letter today where she wrote to my mother and said, why don't you come and rather move close into the same town that we are in so that I can take care of Sonja during the day and you can be with Sonja when you're not working. That's an open heart. She did not judge her husband. She did not care what everybody thought. She was willing to stand up in her family and face her parents and tell her parents whose child this was. And my father couldn't do it. And so the secret stayed with him and her. And I grew up separate from my siblings.
And then you were adopted.
I was, okay, so then my mother had a reconnection of a man who was her brother's friend during school, and they reconnected and they then married, and he adopted me as his child.
Okay. So did he marry your biological mother?
Yes.
Okay. And then he adopted you as his child. Okay.
Yes.
So you stayed with your biological mother in the same, you grew up with her.
I grew up with my biological mother.
Yeah.
And he then adopted me. So I want to go further into judgment.
Yes.
So my dad goes to his dad and tells his dad that he is engaged with this woman, with this child. In this Namibia, everybody knows everybody. So everybody knew that my mother was a mother with an illegitimate child. And his father said, if you marry her, I will disinherit you. We need to understand the judgment here.
Very deep.
It is massive. And then my dad said to him, I am going to marry her with or without your blessing. So for me, again, that's an open heart. That is a man who does not judge the woman or the child. It is going out there and taking on a responsibility with the judgment of everybody around him. Now, let's just look at the different energy of these two men. My father had to keep his standing in society, and he was the one who actually trespassed into territory he should not have trespassed. The second man that comes along does not have exactly that same judgment. His judgment is the alliance with a woman with a legitimate child. He did not, his trespassing is the love he has for a woman. It's not the same judgment, it's a different energy. But the interesting part is that my mother and my dad got married on my dad's family farm. And even though there are siblings that his dad had with his second wife that are younger than me, so my dad's siblings, there's one or two that are younger than me, they are in the wedding photo. I am not in the wedding photo.
Wow.
Because of the judgment of the legitimate child.
Wow.
One needs to conceptualize this. And the reason I was not in the wedding photo was that I should have never found out that I am not his child. My question is, how could that have been a secret forever?
Yeah, doesn't make sense. Wow.
I tell you why it makes sense.
Yeah.
To protect the child from other judgment.
So they married first.
Yes.
And then they adopted you.
I was adopted just before I went to school because the school records needed. So in order to upkeep this scenario, I had to take on his name for the future going forward. So that is why the adoption then happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So then you are excluded in that wedding photo. And say more about that. How did it impact you later or whenever you discovered it?
So the interesting part is that people believe that a child is not aware of all these happenings. But what we know in family constellations now is that in a family constellation, we see that a system is not complete when there's exclusions. I tell you how it impacted me. I never felt part of my dad's family. I always felt excluded. I never felt part of that family. I can say for sure that my dad loved me unconditionally because he was willing to give up his inheritance. And in fact, he did give up his inheritance. For the
so
mother.
That was a huge, huge sacrifice behind this adoption. It's amazing.
It is a massive sacrifice, and it cost him his inheritance. It was a difficult situation for my dad's father because he knew he was busy wronging his son, but in himself, that judgment of what is right and what is wrong, and what is right is this way, and what is wrong is this way. So we need to understand in the German philosophy, there is only right or wrong. There is nothing in between. And my grandfather had this problem that my father was the eldest son. So in German general law, the eldest son inherits the property, in this case, the family farm. Unfortunately for my parents, there were no more other children. I was the only child because my dad had blackwater malaria and that made him sterile.
Okay.
So there were no other children. And my grandfather could not allow himself to allow the child to go to another man's seed. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
So the child would not then stay in the seed of the family, the bloodline. And that was his biggest problem. And we can understand that, and I can understand that. So I have absolutely no ill feeling on that decision. I have great, great sadness for my father, who was totally disinherited, but completely.
Yeah.
And that I have a great sadness for. But my dad was basically punished for his open heart and the love of his wife. And that's sad.
And what's lovely for me is you call him your dad, and yet he's your adopted dad, right?
Yes, he's my dad. He's my heart father.
Yeah.
And in Constellations, we make that distinction between the heart dad and the birth father.
And the biological father. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So you speak about your life on the farm. Was that on his farm?
No, it wasn't, because he had to leave the family farm. He was supporting his father on the family farm. And then when he married, he needed to find other work. And he knew the work of a farmer, so he became a farmhand on a farm in the vicinity, and he was a farmer.
So he had to restart completely because the family system rejected him.
Yes. So he had to restart from scratch. My recollections are not of the farm that they started, where they were, because I was a toddler at that time. So I was 18 months old when my parents then moved in together on this farm. But I was a toddler, and I had the freedom of living with the chickens, living with whatever farm animals were around. And that is basically where I had all time by myself. I had no other interaction with people other than if somebody came and visited. And then I was can't say I was quite a shy child, but I was a very withdrawn child. But I remember this, and this is me being cute. I remember that when somebody would ask me, "What is your name?" And adults, they ask you, "What's your name?" And to make sure they would remember my name, I would always say, "My name is Sonja. Sê ja vir die son." And I think that is my outlook on life. So this is a good place to leave it. Allowing my name to be in a positive view of saying yes to each and every day.
That's beautiful. So from the first 18 months, the screaming Sonja, the screaming child, the difficult one, there was now already an early transformation to a positive self-esteem.
Yes, one could look at it like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely.
So I think this is a beautiful way we can leave it today, and
Mm,
then we pick it up somewhere else next time.
okay.